I'm going to be talking to Dr. Josipa Petrunic, President and CEO of CUTRIC, the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Investment Consortium, about a new report, the Canadian ZEB Database, Canada's Zero-Emission Bus Landscape and Electrification Readiness. So welcome to the interview, Josipa.
Thanks so much for having me, Markham.
Well, it's good to see you again. Now, I haven't talked to you, I haven't interviewed you about electric transit in Canada for a while. So this is a great interview to kind of catch up to where Canada is. Why don't we start with an overview of your report, please?
Sure. So this is the first report we put out that we're going to have regular updates on in the country. It's basically an accounting of how many electric buses are out there actually in Canada. And you hear all kinds of numbers, people throwing around all kinds of numbers because nobody's actually tracking it. So this report tracks exactly how many battery electric buses and how many hydrogen fuel cell electric buses are promised, how many are actually purchased, how many actually arrive to transit agencies, and how many actually hit the ground running with passengers on board. And there's a big difference between those steps. So that's what the report does. And it essentially points out that right now, based on our trajectory, there are about 120 some electric buses out there in Canada on roads with people in them. There's about 700, 800 promised by all the agencies out there. And there's a trend line to a couple thousand in the next 2 years. But on current trend lines, we won't hit the 5,000 electric bus by 2024 marker. That won't really happen until 2027. So we're a little bit behind schedule in Canada. The adoption's not as fast as it needs to be, but it's not terrible either.
So we're basically a year or two away from the speed at which we need to be.
We're about a couple of years away from where the government would like us to be federally. And that's not surprising because from the time you decide to buy electric buses as a city council to the time you figure out what you actually need by the laws of physics, to the time you figure out what you can afford because it's all so expensive, to the time you buy it and it arrives is about 2 years. So even transit agencies that decided last year, we're going in for it, we're going to go all electric, they're just starting the purchasing process now. And those buses don't arrive for a year after they buy them. So it's about a 3-year cycle from idea to they're on the road.
Now, in previous interviews, you've described how, some of the barriers to adoption here, because there has to be the charging infrastructure has to be built, and some of that is along routes. There has to be staff retraining. So this is not a simple process. Are we still looking at the same kinds of barriers to adoption that we did a year, 2, 3 ago?
4 or 5 years ago, the big barrier was city councils weren't requiring it. So it was nobody's mandate to do it. It was just kind of moralistic, ethical talk about the environment. What's changed now is pretty much every city and every city council in the country says thou shalt go electric. And now it's the problem of the transit agency to figure out how the heck to do that. So that barrier is overcome. The political will is there. Then barriers that we're now facing are on the planning side. So you have lots of agencies, including, let's say in Alberta, cities like Lethbridge, Red Deer, Okotoks, Cochrane, very small agencies in some cases looking to go electric and they don't know what to buy. So they're just starting that planning work. That's their big barrier. They might not have people on staff that know how to do these calculations because it's not their expertise. So then they have to go and find a consultant, whether it's us or someone else, to do that work. That's the big barrier. Once that barrier is overcome and you get some buses in your fleet, like Edmonton, like Calgary, different kinds of barriers. Now you get your first few buses, maybe your first couple tens of buses, dozens of buses. Suddenly you don't have electrical engineers on staff, and that's a problem. You have to train your drivers. That takes a while. It can be overcome. But then your big barrier is the facilities aren't ready. So the garages were not designed to carry that amount of power load. And so now every transit agency that's kind of mid-sized or bigger is facing the big barrier, which is they have to rebuild their garages or massively retrofit them. The buses are now becoming the easy part. The garage is going to be the hardest part with the amount of power that has to get there and the overhaul. And those garages can be a few $100 millions if they're built from scratch.
What are you getting any feedback from utilities about the providing that power? Because I've done a number of interviews with utilities and economists and so on, and the distribution. First of all, you got to generate that extra electricity from someplace, and it has to be clean. So getting it to where it needs to go is another problem. So you need the infrastructure to distribute it. So what's the feedback from utilities been on this?
Yeah, in the last few years, the big question from utilities that were even interested in this, and like that's very few utilities in Canada, because last year, as you know, I think Markham, we released a report about utilities, and almost no utility in the country is ready for electric transit. They don't have a strategy, they don't have plans, so they're really starting. Their big question was how much power? Tell us, like, how much energy, how much power? And so now we've completed a lot of the work to show, okay, it might be a few megawatts, it might be a couple dozens of megawatts. These are big numbers, right? These are not insignificant numbers. Now we get those numbers at the door. So utilities are saying, okay, it's going to be a lot of power. In most of Canada, we've got the power, but not at the time you need it. So now tell us exactly when do you need it? And so the questions we're getting from utilities is basically what time of day are you going to need all this stuff and what power level? And their big issue that they're going to need to solve in the next 6 months to 6 years really is whose job is it going to be to install, well, buy and install all the energy storage devices or the smart control devices that are going to help to get power at the right power level, at the right amounts, to the garage or to the charger en route at the exact time needed at a price that doesn't nullify entirely the savings over diesel. Because right now an electric bus is pretty cheap to operate no matter where you are in Canada. Even very expensive electrical grid systems in Ontario, like Hydro One, one of the most expensive in the country. You live there, you're paying some pretty high energy prices. And even there, it's cheaper to operate an electric bus than a diesel bus at current diesel prices. But when you add in all the power demands and all the charges utilities charge you when you pull all this high power at the wrong time of the day, especially, all of a sudden those savings disappear. And so to avoid that, somebody at utilities is going to have to figure out some smart charging controls and energy storage devices. Right now, utilities really aren't leading that discussion. Right now, it's transit agencies leading that discussion. That's a tough one for them.
Now, the federal government has stepped up with, I think it was what, $15 billion a couple of years ago. So is the federal, and because we understand the federal government is fairly committed to transitioning transit agencies over to electric, will they step forward likely with the dollars needed to overcome some of these, barriers you just discussed?
Yeah, well, right now what we have is $2.75 billion for electric transit, which means nothing to anybody because these are big numbers, right? It's a lot of money. It's fair to say it's more money than has ever been thrown at transit for electric transit before. So that's good. And then from 2026 onward, it's going to be about $3 billion per year. That's good because that's never happened before. So whether it's electric or not, transit is going to get more federal support than it's ever had before. That is good for Canadians. Is it enough? Well, no, because just to electrify TTC is several billions of dollars. It is just a massive amount of money. And that's just one transit agency. So can the federal government cover it all? No, and they shouldn't. The big missing piece in this Canadian Confederacy puzzle is the provinces. Right now, the cities have stepped up with a bunch of money for electric transit and they passed the mandates and they're going green to the extent they can with the taxes they have. And the federal government has stepped up to its credit with billions of dollars that never existed before. The provinces are almost nowhere except for Quebec and British Columbia. And outside of Quebec and British Columbia, there's a smattering of investment, like a sprinkling over here in Edmonton, a sprinkling over here in Ontario at a couple of the agencies, but it's not a systematic provincial investment in this space. So there's a big delta of hundreds of millions of dollars. And that is going to have to be solved by provinces who have the job of funding transit as a local service.
Well, I can't say I'm surprised in some respects, Josipa, because this is a big change. And there are always challenges that are encountered when changes of this magnitude are undertaken. Are you confident that we're going to get this all sorted out before 2030?
I am. Will it be perfect? No. Is it going to be messy? Yes. Are lots of things going to go wrong? Absolutely. Are we going to waste some taxpayer dollars? Yep, for sure. Because technology innovation is complicated and it's going to fail more than it succeeds in the first few years. So if we walk in with those expectations, knowing at least we're on the right side of history, it's not like we're funding a fossil fuel extraction industry right now here, for the future. What we're funding is the future of sustainability. So we can accept some of those losses. I am then quite optimistic. And the reason for that is if we think of the big challenge being the provinces being missing in action, well, provinces not only control transit, they also control utilities. And these are two big pieces. And right now in Canada, it is pretty darn hard to get elected as a politician, provincially or federally, in any party, if you do not have some reasonable perspective on climate change. So that's what gives me optimistic faith that over the next several years, especially the next 8 years, it's going to be impossible for any representative of any political party at any jurisdictional level to not choose to invest in this space. Maybe not perfect, but the null set that we're not going to do anything, we're going to drag our feet and go backward, those days are gone. And that gives me faith.
Josipa, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for this.
Thanks so much.